Alright, I'm going to try to demonstrate how to get this cooling inlet installed on this, hopefully without knocking this tripod around and messing up the camera angle. So of course here we are at the engine, and you'll notice that I have the two flat washers in place that need to be between the cooling inlet and the valve cover. And I've got all my PAL nuts removed on these three studs here. Now you'll note, of course, that the studs stick out away from the engine. So the whole assembly is going to need to be put down in front of the studs and then pushed back up against the nuts. And that is actually relatively easy to do. So initially I'll bring the inlet over and I'll put it down in between the cylinders here into place, and then push the whole assembly back into the engine block so that the inside piece will rest up against these nuts. Alright, so let me grab the assembly here. There'll be a still photograph of this, but this is the general idea here. And I'll go ahead and I'll position it behind the cooling fins here, and I'll work it down between the cylinders, and I'll try to be careful not to let any of these sharp edges around here scratch up my valve covers. And again I've got it pulled out away from the engine a little bit to clear the studs back here, and I'll just drop this in. Like that. Okay, now you can see that it's relatively in place, but it's not pushed back all the way. What I like to do, since I have this center baffle here, is I like to push on that baffle so that itself will be pushed back, and it basically takes the sides with it. So I'll just push this back here like that, push that in all the way, and everything else is now set and ready to go. And that's all there is to it. And I'll grab my couple of valve cover bolts and I'll install those. And again, you can see that the flat washers are trapped between the air inlet itself and the valve cover. And this is pretty much how this is going to go together, because when the entire assembly is fabricated and complete, this top piece here is going to be removable. I'm going to put nut plates along this edge here, and then the top will get just screwed on. So you'll take the top off, put this assembly on just as I've demonstrated, run your spark plug cables, and then put the cover, if you will, back into place. And then of course, I'm not going to do all of these, but you would come back then with your PAL nuts and put those on wherever, on all 6 of these stud locations, to hold everything together. And I believe on the other valve, or on the other inlet cover, I did have a stud back here on one of the cylinders that was so short that I could not get a PAL nut on that one particular stud, and that's okay. You don't really need all 6 of them. If you can't get all 6 of them on, that's okay. There's enough back here that it's going to hold this in place really well as is. And that's it. Alright, so next up I think I'll work on the piece that goes in front here. I've already got that fabricated. But I'll go ahead and get that installed, and that of course stiffens up this whole front end, and then the top piece then will stiffen up this here. And when it's all assembled, it's pretty stout. I think you'll be very pleased with it. So let me move on to this front piece, and then we'll start on the top cover. Here is the front piece of the cooling inlet that I had fabricated earlier. And here is the inside side piece for the inlet that I'm currently working on. this piece here, trying to get this oriented correctly. All right, here we go. This piece then mounts on the inlet in this manner here. This is the front part of the inlet, and if you look at the template, you'll notice that I've got these lines indicated. Oops, this is the wrong side. Here we go. I've got this line here that runs across the bottom where this straight piece changes from this vertical piece to this angle. And this location here is where you want this piece. So I've taken that line from the template and I've transferred it to the piece itself. And now this front piece then gets lined up with that line like this. And then of course you've got to match the angle here with the front edge here. So the angle of this bend here, this bend from here and then back this way, has to match the line that's drawn across the piece here and the angle across the front of it here. Alright, once you get that, then all you need to do is line up the piece with the line here and then line up this front edge here, and then you can go ahead and mark your hole locations down through the piece itself, which I have just done. And then you'll do the same thing for the other side using your other piece. And you can see I've already got my line drawn on my other piece. So now this then will get transferred to this piece the same way. I'll line up this line and this edge. Let me get this out of the way. I will now line up this line and this edge with this, like that, just like I did the one that I just showed you. And then once you get that lined up, you come through and you mark your hole locations. Alright, so that's what I'm going to work on now. Once I get those hole locations marked, I'm going to drill the holes. I'm going to go ahead and temporarily screw all of this together, check the fit, and then I'll work on the top cover. I have that front piece now in place temporarily back on the engine just to see how it fits. And there are a few things I want to point out. As I had said earlier, that the whole assembly has to be placed down onto the cylinders and then pushed back. It has to come down and clear these studs and then get pushed back into place. In order to do that, you need to have a gap between this back fin and this edge here on this piece. There needs to be a gap here so that when this, you can have this assembly forward up against the back of this fin, and then once it's dropped down into place, you can push it back up against these back nuts here and put your pal nut on. So if you've got a tight fit between this piece and here, you're never going to be able to get the whole assembly down to clear these studs. This gap here is actually a little bit too tight. I had to, as it was coming down, it was rubbing on the stud, and this edge here was rubbing on the back of the cylinder, so I'm going to have to file this back a little bit to make a bigger gap. I can go over to my other one that is finished. Of course, the lighting is not as good because it's got the cover on it, but you can potentially see the gap between the back of the fin and this edge right here is quite a bit bigger. That's what I need to do to the other one. So the other thing I wanted to point out Of course, since from one side of the engine to the other side of the engine, things are a little bit different. On this right side of the engine, on this front piece, I had to notch it just a little bit to clear this inlet elbow. I don't know if I can get under here good enough. This aluminum comes down and then it's bent under here to give it some strength, and I had to cut a notch to clear this. On the other side, I did not have to do that. So there are going to be little things like that that you may encounter, and I'll try to make note of those on the templates while I'm thinking about it. But just be aware that when you make a part for this side, it's not going to be exactly the same as the same part for the other side of the engine. Again, this is just an example of that, because on the other side of the engine, the cooling elbow is not in the way, so there's no notch. Alright, let me fix this little gap issue here, and I'm going to move on to getting the top in place. I've decided, while I try to fit the top piece of the air inlet, I don't have clecos or anything of that nature. I really don't have any sheet metal working type of tools. So what I need to do, and it's very tedious and it's very time consuming, so I don't recommend doing it this way, but it was pretty much my only choice. So for instance, I'll take this leg here and I'll position it where I want it to my side piece. Of course, lining up the edge here and lining up this edge here. I'll hold it in place, and I'll take a Sharpie marker, and while holding it in place, I'll just come in with my Sharpie and mark the hole locations. And then I'll move this out of the way, drill the holes. Then I'll come back, put the pieces together temporarily with screws. And then I made this bend by hand while this was screwed into place. I bend this around and form it. Once I get it bent and formed, then I'll hold this tab where I want it, mark the hole with the Sharpie marker, take the screws out, take this piece out of the way, take this piece over to the drill press, and then drill this hole. And then, as you can see, I come back and I hold it back together with screws. Now I'm doing this leg here. So again, I'll position this leg in position onto the side piece, lining up the edges. And then I'll, again, once I have it where I want it, I'll hold it in place, and I'll use a Sharpie marker, and I'll mark down through the holes, which I've already done, which you can see there. Now I'll remove these screws, and then I'll drill these 3 holes, and then I'll come back and put all of these screws back in to hold it in place, and then I'll bend this leg to match this edge here. And again, once I get it where I want it, I'll hold it in place, mark down through the holes, remove all the screws, drill these holes, and then I'll start working on this side the same way. So it's very tedious and it does take time, but quite frankly, that's pretty much the only way that I personally can do it, because I don't have the proper tooling. But it does work, it just takes time. So let me get this finished up and move on from there. Here are the cooling inlets that I've finally finished. These are completely finished except for replacing the various screws with rivets. The plan is to have everything riveted except for this top piece. So these screws that hold the top in place will be replaced with nut plates. I'll put nut plates on the flange of this piece. So the top will be held on with screws. These 2 locations here will also be nut plates on this piece underneath. So these screws can be removed. These screws along the top here and here can be removed, and this can come off so that you have access to the spark plugs and the spark plug wires. Those are going to come out of here and run through here and then into my magnetos. Let me think. Okay, another few tidbits. On this is the left side inlet, and underneath I had to notch it for this elbow, and I had to notch it for the way that I have my cables run for the spark plugs. So by notching it, I eliminated the bend that runs along this entire length. So now this back plate here is a little bit flimsy. So what I've chosen to do, at least for now, I put a hole in it, and I'll probably run some wire. I think I'll put like a piece of heavy welding wire maybe across here with safety wire tied to it, and then I'm going to pull the safety wire tight like this and wrap it around my push rod tube underneath here. That will pull this in and it will keep it from flapping. That's on the left side. The right side, there's no notches on the bottom, and this is nice and stiff. I also added this vertical piece here because this top was flopping around, so I added that. And then I believe I've already shown underneath, which I don't know that this is going to get. There's a bracket here that attaches the front of the inlet to the nut, a PAL nut here off of the cylinder. And I believe that just about covers it. So they are in, and considering the time and effort that I put into them, they look good. I spent a lot of time and effort. I've been working on them basically since July. It is now January 3rd. On and off, mostly on, but a lot of design and redesign and rework and fitting and refitting and throwing that ideal away and trying something else. So trying to fit around through all my mess here to get these shots. And like I was saying, on this on the right side, there's no notches on here, so this is nice and stiff. But I did have to notch the front for that elbow there on the right side. So it's just those little things you need to watch out for. And as always, like I mentioned throughout the video, I highly recommend that you fit and refit and check and recheck as you go to make sure that the holes are correct, that the dimensions are correct, and you can get these things to fit piece by piece as you put them together.